As we get started today, I want to invite you to think about a time when you've been maybe completely off about someone. You meet them and you're sure they're your new best friend, and it turns out they're the worst. Or you think you've met the biggest jerk ever, and in fact, they were just having a bad day or something really painful had just happened in their lives. When has someone surprised you? Got a story or two in mind, maybe? So for me, and for the past couple months, I've been using my time on the trail near my house to listen through the audio versions of the Harry Potter series because I like to keep up with the times, what the kids are into. Oh, so I didn't read them when they were, all the rage, when everyone was going crazy over them. I had a kid. I was way too busy being a workaholic, church planting, and so on. And so I've been listening to them now, and they are amazing. I'm loving it. So I'm in book 5 right now. And that's the one, if you've read them, where or seen the movies, it's the one where Snape is trying to teach Harry to keep Voldemort out of his head. And Snape is the worst, right? He hates Harry. He's always happy when something goes wrong for him and is often a part of making it go wrong. He tells him awful things about his dad, who died when Harry was a baby. His hair is always disgusting and gross. His classroom is literally a dungeon. He's awful. And the only reason he's helping Harry is that Dumbledore is making him. But fast forward to the end of the stories. So spoiler, if you are even more behind and you've not than me, and you've not either read or watched the movies, gonna ruin it for you. I apologize in advance. But fast forward to the end, and it turns out that Snape has been there to protect Harry all along. He's been there. He's been there for him, on his side. He wasn't who he seemed. And our text for today is about someone like that, who seems like an obvious outsider and even a villain. But the reality turns out to be more complicated. We're going to be talking about Luke 7, those first 10 verses. So feel free to pause the video and pull up the passage if you'd like to read along. Luke starts by telling us that Jesus had just finished doing some teaching and that there was this centurion who had a valued slave who was close to death. They're in Capernaum, which was Jesus' home base during his public ministry. When he wasn't out traveling, his home was in Capernaum. And Jesus had just been teaching about things like loving enemies, refusing to judge, trees being known by their fruit. And he'd been talking about not just listening to his teaching, but acting on it. But the whole reason that the crowds had gathered, it actually wasn't to hear this great lecture series by this wise teacher. They were there, Luke says, because they wanted to be healed. And, I want to suggest that that's actually really understandable when you think about the state of health in Jesus' day. There was think about it, no knowledge of how disease spread, no germ theory. That actually didn't come around until around the time of the Civil War, which in the scheme of things is pretty recent, actually. So in Jesus' day, something like the flu or pneumonia or appendicitis, almost always a death sentence. Lots of babies didn't live past their first year, and many, many women died in childbirth. So that by the time a kid was around 10 years old, around half of his or her friends would have died from accidents or illness. And few made it to adulthood with both of their parents still alive. So by their 30s, most people had rotting teeth, failing eyesight. Because imagine, how many of us have contacts or glasses? How many of us have, had a cavity in our lifetimes? Can you imagine never having gone to the dentist? And it was exceedingly rare for someone to live around the age of 40, actually. So if you're over 40, like me, You are a miracle of longevity in Jesus' day. So I don't think it's actually that surprising that they were trying to get close to someone who could help them. Luke says that they were pressing in to touch Jesus, for power came out of him when they did. Remember the woman with the issue of blood? She got close enough in this whole mob of people to lean in and touch his robe. And Jesus says, the passage says, Jesus stopped everything because he felt power go out of him. This is the kind of thing that Luke is describing. Which brings us back to today's passage. There was this Roman official who had been hearing about what Jesus could do and needed help. So he sent word with Jewish elders asking for Jesus to come and heal this beloved servant of his, and Jesus set out to do it. There are actually a few things that are surprising about this. It's unusual for a centurion to be seeking a Jew's help with anything. The Jews looked down on the Romans, and the Romans looked down on the Jews. So picture maybe colonial times, say like the British in India. The Romans tended to see themselves as more civilized and cultured, almost as if they were kind of doing the natives a favor. But the text tells us that this centurion was actually respectful to the Jews. Verse 5 says that he even had funded a place of worship and study for them. What about Jesus? He's on the way to enter the home of a foreigner, a Roman. This was not done. There were too many chances to be made unclean or tainted by idolatry. See, Israel had experienced years, generations of oppression, of hard labor, exile, and many of them were praying that God would show up and help them. And they were sincerely trying to live faithfully, to cultivate this culture, this space where God would desire to return to them. You know, some of the Pharisees and groups like them that were pushing things like elaborate hand washing and tithing down to the penny, I think many of them were doing that not because they were controlling or petty, but because they thought it was the kind of thing God wanted, right? I think a lot of fundamentalisms come from this place, or start out that way at least. And so Jesus is doing something that would have absolutely earned him criticism by heading to this foreigner's house. But he's not actually the first well-known prophet or teacher to do so. By Jesus' day, Elijah and Elisha had become famous as these kind of model prophets. They, particularly Elijah, were like the Alexander Hamiltons of that time, more famous generations later than they were when they were alive. And they did it all. They preached, returned to God and God's ways, and they performed these incredible deeds of healing, revealing God's power. The book of Malachi talks about one like Elijah coming and bringing restoration before what Malachi calls the great and terrible day of the Lord. And this is what people meant in Jesus' day when they were constantly asking either John the Baptist or Jesus, are you the prophet? Are you the one we were told to expect? And in fact, in one of Jesus' early sermons in his hometown, Jesus reminded people that in the course of being an ideal prophet of God, Elijah had helped a foreigner, a Sidonian widow. And not only that, Elijah had not healed Israeli lepers, but he had chosen to heal a Syrian ruler who had that disease. So how do you think the people Jesus grew up with responded to this insight? Did they thank Jesus for reminding them of that part of the story? Oh, thanks, Jesus, we had forgotten. We get it. Thanks for the reminder. That is absolutely not how they responded. Luke 4 says that they were furious. They were enraged. They tried to kill Jesus, tried to throw him off a cliff. But here Jesus is again in today's passage, not just talking about healing and helping the villains in the story, which for them would be anyone but God and Israel, but actually on his way to help one. But when Jesus got close, the centurion sent friends to say he wasn't worthy of Jesus entering his home. What the heck? After all this, he's not even going to let Jesus come? What is going on here? Remember, the Jews had just been talking about how worthy the centurion was of being helped by Jesus. And he would have had high standing in his own culture as a leader. He was rich enough to fund a synagogue. The centurion would not have been lacking people telling him he was great, seeking to curry his favor. There was every reason to expect his ego to be huge, right? But rather than running with all of that, the centurion treats Jesus with humility and with respect. And his humility is all the more meaningful since, as he says himself, he's used to having his orders obeyed. But he refuses to rely on his authority or his position in seeking Jesus' help. He sends word explaining that he understands Jesus' power kind of by analogy of his own. And he asks Jesus to heal his servant by saying the word from a distance. And that from a distance piece reveals that he's showing respect and honor for Jesus' faith and religious practices, which would have indicated that it was improper for him to enter the home of the centurion. Don't forget as well, Jesus' own people had been crowding around to touch him because they needed help. They wanted to be whole. And many of them prided themselves on being God's chosen people and on knowing exactly what to look for when the prophet who would restore things came. But here is this foreigner, this Roman, who gets more about Jesus' power and who Jesus is than they do. And Jesus is amazed. He could not believe the centurion's faith. He was blown away. He told the crowd he hadn't seen that kind of trust or understanding anywhere in Israel. So here's the centurion, the last person those with Jesus would have expected him to praise. They believed the best way to honor God was to follow the law. And they understood part of that to mean keeping separate from anyone who wasn't a Jew. That is why it is such a big deal that Jesus had been heading to his home in the first place. It's why in Jesus' day the Samaritans were so hated. They hadn't kept separate, but they'd intermarried with non-Jews. See, the people with Jesus and in Israel in that day, they were missing that God's blessing wasn't meant only for them and their people. They had forgotten the second part of God's promise to Abram, that flourishing was meant to spill over for the good of all people. It wasn't meant to be hoarded or kept in a box. It was meant to overflow. And because they had forgotten that, it would have been absolutely shocking for them that Jesus was setting up this Roman as an example of faith. And even Jesus, for his part, had just been teaching, "Woe to you who are rich, for you've received your consolation. Woe to you when everyone's speaking well of you. You're forgetting what happened with the false prophets." But here Jesus is saying, he's inviting us to not have too simplistic an understanding of those concepts. Because the centurion was rich, he was spoken highly of in this very passage. He certainly did not have to struggle with where his next meal was coming from. So you would think that would mean that he's exactly the kind of person that Jesus would condemn, much less the larger culture. But not so. Jesus was not intending to write off everyone who has a 401k. He wasn't saying you should do crappy work to make sure you never give anyone a reason to praise you. His point is that if you are basing your worth on how much money and respect and how well liked you are missing the point. It's like James talks about how the poor can take comfort in their value as people created in God's image, even as the rich can recognize that their wealth does not, in fact, make them more worthy. Jesus said to watch for what people do. He said you'll know them by their fruit. And the fruit of the centurion's life was faith. Jesus is enacting something incredibly powerful here. He's taking the example of Elijah and Elisha one step further. Because he's showing that he's not only willing to share a meal with and even heal foreigners as they both did, but he's going further by calling out this foreigner's faith, implying that he might be welcome in God's household. He's initiating the invitation to God's kingdom for the kind of person they least expected. He was pointing to God's flourishing beginning to overflow to all families of the earth in practice. And that is why Luke ends with the call to preach the good news of God's good ways to all nations. They are all welcome in God's family. Because look who gets the last word in this passage. It's not the centurion. It is not even Jesus. It's the slave. The story ends with this unnamed slave being found in good health. Just as the centurion believed was possible, Jesus is able to heal him or her. The text doesn't actually make it clear, without being physically present. And so the slave is healed. The message is that God's emerging kingdom is good news for the poor. It's good news for the least. It's good news for anyone who comes, anyone who knows enough to know they need to ask for help. And here it is about to be good news for another widow and her son, because as Elijah did, Jesus is about to revive the only son of a woman in need. That's the story that Luke tells just after this one, and it is no coincidence that they're put together. So, what does all of this mean for us? I think there are several things that we can take away at least. I think it means first that we have an invitation here to question the nature of our faith, especially when we're most sure we're in the right. Is our connection and our sense of connection with God based on our ability to correctly apply our version of the law? Or is it based on letting God and God's ways further and further into our lives? Dina Williams says faith precipitates a way of life that includes compassion for all people, friends, enemies, and especially those in need. Faith is clearly not the venue of a privileged set, she writes, but includes Gentiles, centurions, women, widows, and sinners. In Luke's gospel, healing is available to all people through faith or trust in the compassion of the Most High. I think this passage also invites us to the kind of faith that welcomes the stranger. This is such a headline throughout Scripture. We talk about it a lot for that reason. And it's definitely a headline in this passage. We're invited to reconsider, to look again at those we assume are villains, outsiders, those outside of what's welcome among us, right? Outside of God's family. And I think this story invites us, in fact, to be on the lookout for a Professor Snape in our lives. That said, let me be really clear. I am not talking about giving abusers and oppressors free rein in our lives. Not at all. I'm talking about reconciliation. I read an interview with former President Carter this week, and he quoted Galatians 3:28. There's neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, neither male nor female. We are all one in Christ Jesus. And then he said this. He said, in his day, Jesus broke down walls of separation and superiority among people. Those, mostly men who practice superiority and exclusion, contradict my interpretation of the life and teachings of Jesus, which exemplified peace, love, compassion, humility, forgiveness, and sacrificial love. I think the last thing that this story invites us to consider is where we might need to ask for help and for healing for ourselves and also for others. Where do you need God's power to show up in your life? And what might it look like to risk trusting and risk asking? And I wonder if maybe we need to follow the example of the father who wanted Jesus to heal his child. Jesus asked him if he really believed he could do it. And the man said, I believe. Help my unbelief. Amen.